Germany had a long tradition of political espionage long before Adolf Hitler delivered his first speech in a beer hall. During the Revolution of 1848, King Ludwig I of Bavaria authorized the systematic surveillance of political opponents in taverns and meeting halls. When the German Empire was created in 1871, the state of Prussia, which covered 60% of German territory, already had its own political police. Department Vieh, led by Wilhelm Stieber, born in Merseburg on May 3, 1818, from a middle-class family, trained as a lawyer before entering the police force. Stieber became famous as Bismarck's master spy. In his instructions to agents, Stieber wrote something that would resonate decades later. The agent should maintain an ordinary bourgeois appearance, build trust within the circles in which he operated, and make others believe he was just another neighbor. It was, in essence, the handbook of modern social infiltration. When the empire collapsed in 1918, the new democratic government of Weimar did not dissolve the Prussian political police. It renamed it Department 1A and later simply Department 1. In 1928, the Prussian Minister of the Interior defined it as the organization responsible for observing, preventing, and prosecuting all crimes of a political nature. By 1930, it had approximately 1,000 employees distributed across the 44 administrative districts of Prussia. Most of its agents came from the regular criminal police force, men trained to investigate, monitor, and gather evidence. This fact is essential to understanding what came next. The Gestapo was not invented by the Nazis. It was inherited from the Weimar Republic, reinforced with ideology and freed from any legal limitations. During the Weimar Republic, that Prussian political police monitored communists, but it also kept watch over the Nazi Party. It initiated a total of 40,000 proceedings against party members before 1933. The speeches of all Nazi leaders were routinely monitored. There was a special commission for inspecting far-right parties. The historical irony is that the same archives later used to persecute opponents of Nazism had originally been built to monitor the Nazis themselves. The Reichstag fire on the night of February 27, 1933, changed everything. Marinus van der Lubbe, a 22-year-old Dutch communist, was arrested inside the burning parliamentary building. It was never fully clarified whether he acted alone or whether the fire was part of a Nazi conspiracy. General Franz Halder testified at the Nuremberg trials that he heard Göring boast, "I am the only one who really knows what happened in the Reichstag because I set it on fire." Subsequent historiography has debated that claim without definitive resolution. What is clear is what happened the next day. On February 28, 1933, Hitler issued the Reichstag fire decree drafted by Wilhelm Frick. In a single decree, all civil liberties guaranteed by the Weimar Constitution were suspended for the protection of the people and the state. From that moment on, anyone could be arrested and placed under protective custody, Schutzhaft, without charges, without a lawyer, without time limit. There was no possible legal defense. The system that would make it possible to build the Gestapo was already in place. The first Gestapo law, promulgated on April 26, 1933 by Göring, officially established the Geheime Staatspolizei, whose mission was to investigate political activities throughout the state that constitute a danger to the state. Göring found its headquarters, number 8 Prince Albrecht Strasse in Berlin. There, the Gestapo would have its nerve center from May 1933 until 1945, a building that over time would be filled with screams muffled by the thickness of its walls. The struggle for control, Göring, Himmler, and the bureaucratic war. 4 names defined the creation of the Gestapo: Hermann Göring and Rudolf Diels in Prussia, Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich in Bavaria. Hermann Göring was born in Rosenheim on January 12, 1893, the son of an army officer and a friend of Bismarck. Expelled from several schools during his adolescence, he found his vocation in the newly created German Air Forces in 1914. He became a daring flying ace in the elite squadron of Baron von Richthofen, the legendary Bloody Red Baron, and was awarded the Iron Cross First Class and the Pour le Mérite, the highest honor in aviation. After the war, he returned to Munich without a job. In the autumn of 1922, he heard Hitler speak in a beer hall and joined the Nazi Party. He took part in the Munich Putsch of 1923, suffered 2 gunshot wounds, developed a severe morphine addiction that briefly led him to a psychiatric hospital, and spent several years abroad before returning to German politics as one of Hitler's main advisors in the early 1930s. When Göring was appointed Prussian Minister of the Interior, he immediately established a close relationship with Rudolf Diels, head of the Prussian political police. Diels was an experienced civil servant and administrator, flexible and opportunistic. In his biased memoirs, he downplayed his sudden shift from supporting the Weimar Republic to enthusiastically adapting to Nazism. In a 1935 resume, Diels described how he had become deeply involved in the development of the Gestapo, claiming that since 1930 he had devoted himself to combating communism. In short, he was a technician of the system willing to serve whoever was in power. On February 22, 1933, Göring signed a decree allowing members of the SA to join the police as an auxiliary force. Within weeks, the brown-shirted uniforms outnumbered professional police officers by a ratio of 7-1. The result was a wave of terror. The SA organized brutal raids, imprisoned thousands of communists in what would soon be known as wild concentration camps, abandoned warehouses, dilapidated barracks where prisoners were tortured and frequently murdered without any legal process. Diels estimated that between 5,000 and 7,000 political opponents were killed during the first Nazi year. While Göring was building his Gestapo in Prussia, something parallel was unfolding in Bavaria that was potentially more dangerous for Göring's autonomy. Heinrich Himmler was born on October 7, 1900 in Munich into a middle-class Catholic family. His father was a tutor at the court of the Bavarian monarchy. Heinrich was raised with strict discipline, attended church regularly, and raised chickens on a small family farm in Landshut, killing them each day with his own hands, strangling them, before he began reading pamphlets on German nationalism. He joined the Nazi Party in 1923, took part in the Munich Putsch, and escaped without charges. On January 6, 1929, he became head of the SS, Hitler's small personal elite guard, which at that time had barely 52,000 members. He was a workaholic who began his days at 8 in the morning and sometimes continued past midnight. He was meticulous with all documentation. No Nazi leader wrote reports as convincing as Himmler. To strengthen his security organization, Himmler appointed as head of intelligence a man who was extraordinary and extraordinarily dangerous, Reinhard Heydrich. Heydrich was born on March 7, 1904 in Halle, Saxony. Tall, blonde, athletic, a talented pianist and violinist, an excellent fencer and swimmer. His father, Richard, was a renowned opera singer and fervent nationalist. Reinhard enlisted in the Navy in 1922, rose to the rank of lieutenant, but was dismissed in 1931 after a murky scandal. The daughter of an IG Farben director became pregnant, and he refused to marry her, which a naval court of honor considered a disgrace to the institution. His new girlfriend, Lina von Osten, connected him to the Nazi Party. Lina later recalled that when Heydrich joined the party in 1931, he had not even read Hitler's Mein Kampf. He was soon recruited by Himmler, who saw in him the ideal elite officer, energetic, loyal, efficient, ruthless, and bold. By 1932, Himmler and Heydrich had created the SS Security Service, the Sicherheitsdienst or SD, with the aim of tracking and arresting political and racial enemies. There lay the division that for years would define the internal conflict within the Nazi security system. Göring and Diels controlled the Gestapo in Prussia. Himmler and Heydrich controlled the political police in Bavaria and were systematically advancing into the other German states. Between September 1933 and January 1934, Himmler took control of the political police forces in Hamburg, Lübeck, Mecklenburg-Schwerin, Anhalt, Baden, Bremen, Hessen, Thuringia, and Württemberg. Only Prussia and two smaller enclaves remained. Standing in the way of both was a third man, Ernst Röhm, the loud and quarrelsome head of the SA. Röhm was born in Munich on November 28, 1887, the son of a railway worker. He had fought in the First World War, earned the Iron Cross First Class, and bore an ugly scar on his left cheek that gave him a permanently menacing appearance. He was short, stocky, and did not hide his homosexuality, something illegal in Germany at the time under Article 175 of the Penal Code. During 1932, social democratic newspapers published letters in which Röhm confessed homosexual feelings to his doctor, Dr. Karl Günther Heimsoth. The letters were leaked by none other than Rudolf Diels, the head of the Prussian political police, in an act of bureaucratic maneuvering that foreshadowed the internal struggles to come. Röhm wanted the SA to absorb the regular army and also control the new political police force. His ambitions threatened both Göring's control over the Gestapo and Himmler's aspirations. More directly, they threatened the German professional army, whose support Hitler needed to survive politically. The solution came in the early hours of June 30th, 1934. The night of the long knives, the Gestapo's blood baptism. At 4:30 in the morning on June 30th, 1934, Hitler landed at the Oberwiesenfeld airfield near Munich. He led a convoy of vehicles loaded with heavily armed SS guards toward the Hanselbauer Hotel in Bad Wiessee, a spa town south of Munich where Röhm and his entourage were sleeping. The hotel was silent when they arrived. Hitler personally climbed the staircase. He first entered the room of an SA leader named Heines and surprised him in bed with an 18-year-old youth. Then he entered Röhm's room, accompanied by 2 guards, and shouted, "You are under arrest." The detainees were taken to the notorious Stadelheim prison in Munich. The following day, in cell number 474, they left a revolver on the table beside Röhm's bed. It was an invitation to choose the decent way. 10 minutes passed. Silence. The SS officer Theodor Eicher, commandant of the Dachau concentration camp, entered the cell with another agent, both armed. Röhm, sweating profusely, stripped to the waist and stood up in a defiant posture. They shot him several times in the torso. He fell to the ground and died within seconds. In Berlin, Göring, Himmler and Heydrich operated coldly in the manner of gangsters. That morning, SS guards knocked on the door of the home of General Kurt von Schleicher, the former chancellor in the prosperous Berlin district of Neubabelsberg. When the maid opened the door, the men forced their way in, found the general in the living room and fired a hail of bullets at him. His wife tried to protect him. She was also murdered. The couple's 12-year-old daughter found her parents dead on the living room carpet when she returned from school. The radical Nazi Gregor Strasser was taken to Gestapo headquarters on Prince Albrecht Strasse. At the Nuremberg trials, the agent Hans Gisevius described what happened. An SS officer approached the cell door and called Strasser. The man stepped out slowly. A minute later, a shot was heard. The SS officer had shot him in the back. The bullet struck a main artery. A stream of blood splattered the wall of the small cell. Apparently, Strasser did not die immediately. A prisoner in the adjacent cell heard him cursing for almost an hour. No one paid any attention. Finally, Gisevius heard footsteps in the corridor and Heydrich's voice saying, "Isn't he dead yet? Let that pig bleed to death." The night of the long knives ended on the afternoon of July 1st, 1934. Hitler himself presented the killings to the Reichstag on July 13th as necessary measures for national defense. The Reichstag ratified them retroactively. The exact number of dead was never established. Hitler's speech mentioned 74. The White Book, compiled by German dissidents in Paris, estimated 401 deaths, although it identified only 116 by name. The Nuremberg tribunal did not give an exact figure. What became clear was the political outcome. The SA were reduced to irrelevance. Their membership fell from 2.9 million in August 1934 to 1.2 million in April 1938. Himmler and the SS had eliminated their main rival, and the path was clear. On April 20th, 1934, Göring had appointed Himmler inspector of the Prussian Gestapo. Heydrich, who was already leading the SD, took control of the Gestapo, the central administrative section. Göring retained the purely honorary title of Chief of the Secret State Police, but the SS now fully controlled the organization. Himmler's police revolution was underway. On February 10, 1936, the third and most consequential Gestapo law, drafted by Werner Best, decreed that the organization could not be subject to any judicial or administrative court. It was a force above the law in every possible sense. And on June 17, 1936, Hitler signed the decree that made Himmler chief of the German police. The police revolution was complete. On September 27, 1939, all the structures were merged into the Reich Main Security Office, the RSHA, which unified the Gestapo, the Kripo, the Orpo, and the SD into a single centralized authority. The Gestapo, which in 1933 had been limited to Prussia, was now the secret police of all Nazi Germany and would soon extend its reach across Europe. The building of terror: structure, organization, and headquarters. Imagine a four-story building at number 8 Prinz Albrecht Straße in central Berlin. Before 1933, it had been the headquarters of the School of Arts and Crafts. Its halls had hosted exhibitions of industrial design, academic debates, students carrying portfolios under their arms. After May 1933, the basements of that same building would house interrogation cells where prisoners listened to footsteps in the corridor as one listens to a countdown toward nothingness. The RSHA, established from 1939 onward, divided the Gestapo into 6 main sections. Section 1A dealt with Germany's political enemies: Marxists, communists, reactionaries, liberals. Section 4B monitored the political activities of churches, religious sects, Jews, and Freemasons. Section 4C processed orders of protective custody. Section 4D oversaw the occupied territories. Section 4E handled internal and external espionage. Section 4F controlled border police, passports, and the identification of foreigners. At the Berlin headquarters, 1,500 employees worked, but the reality in the cities was very different. Across all of Germany, the Gestapo never reached 16,000 active agents at any point in its history. In 1933, it had barely 1,000 employees. In 1937, 6,500. In 1939, when the war began, 15,000. The peak of 32,000 employees, counting administrative staff, was reached at the end of 1944, when it was already too late for everything. To permanently monitor 66 million Germans, the Gestapo would have needed resources it never had. So how did it really function? Local Gestapo offices suffered from chronic staff shortages. In Cologne, with 750,000 inhabitants, there were only 69 agents in 1942. In small rural towns, there was often no one at all. A single Gestapo agent could be responsible for hundreds of cases simultaneously. The system could not be sustained solely through active surveillance. It needed something else. It needed citizens to watch one another. The administrative structure of the Gestapo was a pyramid. At the top was Heinrich Müller, head of the organization from 1936 to 1945. He was born in Munich in 1900, the son of a police officer from a working-class Catholic family. He left school before completing his studies. His report cards described him as average in all subjects. He had a strong Munich working-class accent that he never tried to conceal. He was an apprentice metal worker at the Bavarian Aviation Company before entering the police force in 1918. He was only 36 years old when he became head of the Gestapo of all Germany. Müller was not a Nazi by conviction. Rudolf Hess declared at Nuremberg that Müller lacked political commitment. He did not join the Nazi Party until 1939, and only for professional reasons. A confidential report from 1937 stated that if Müller's task had been to fight the right instead of the left, he would have done so with equal energy and efficiency. He was the perfect technocrat of terror. Below Müller, the department heads of the central sections had remarkably similar profiles. Born between 1894 and 1903 with university degrees in law from middle-class backgrounds, with prior experience in the criminal police of the Weimar Republic. In Department YVA, which fought communist opposition, almost none had been active members of the Nazi Party before 1933. Only one, Horst Kopkauf, had been. Then there was Adolf Eichmann, born in 1906 in Solingen, Rhineland, raised in Linz, Austria, in the same city where Hitler had lived during his adolescence. His father Karl owned a prosperous mining company. Adolf left school without finishing his studies. In the 1920s, his father used business contacts to secure him jobs in the electrical industry and as an oil salesman. The family business went bankrupt during the Depression. In 1932, Eichmann joined the Austrian Nazi Party. He soon went to the Dachau concentration camp to work and later emerged as a key advisor on Jewish affairs within the SD. His bureaucratic efficiency came to Himmler's attention. Between 1938 and 1940, he organized the deportation of Austrian and Czech Jews to Poland. He was promoted to head of Section 4B4, responsible for the Jewish question, from where he would organize the transfer of all European Jews to the death camps. In the regional offices, the directors were typically young law graduates, many with doctorates, who were under 40 years old. In 1938, 87% of regional directors held law degrees and nearly half had earned doctorates. They resembled a room of university academics more than a police department. Experience in the police force became increasingly less relevant for promotion. What mattered was the university degree and demonstrated ideological loyalty. The rank-and-file agents were very different. They came from working-class or lower-middle-class backgrounds, had left school at 16 without qualifications, and almost none had university degrees. It is estimated that 50% of the ordinary agents working in the Gestapo in 1939 were career policemen from the Weimar period. This contrast is fundamental. The Gestapo leadership was ideologically committed and academically brilliant. The base was pragmatic and professional. And the two groups interacted according to a simple logic. The directors defined ideological objectives and the agents executed them using the methods of the classic criminal detective. Methods: interrogation, preventive custody, and torture. Every Gestapo case followed an established procedure that, in theory, was surprisingly bureaucratic. First came the report, by mail, by telephone, in person, sometimes anonymous. The local department head reviewed the accusation. If it warranted investigation, an agent was assigned. The agent gathered information, organized the arrest of the accused if necessary, and carried out interrogations. A temporary arrest order was issued, allowing the suspect to be held for 10 days before charges were filed. A formal preventive custody required specific charges and had to be endorsed by the designated prosecutor, and sometimes also by the central office in Berlin. Every detainee was fingerprinted and photographed. Each file was assigned to a single individual, even if multiple people were involved. The cover sheet of the dossier contained name, date and place of birth, address, marital status, religion, prior convictions, military record, and previous periods in prisons or camps. The body of the file consisted of interrogation transcripts and witness testimonies. Many files ran to hundreds of pages. Each was compiled under the implicit assumption that it could end up in court. The central element of the investigation was the interrogation. Here is where theory and practice diverged dramatically. The official Gestapo instruction manual recommended applicable investigative techniques during interrogation, a deliberately vague formulation that left the door open to violence. The most common officially authorized punishment was the application of up to 25 blows with a bamboo cane to the buttocks in the presence of a doctor. As the communist activist Jan Valten recalled, he received blows so strong that his shirt was soaked in blood. But survivors described methods far worse that never appeared in official documents. Water torture, submerging the prisoner in ice-cold water until near suffocation, prolonged sleep deprivation, application of electric currents to the hands, anus, and genitals, crushing of testicles with a device similar to a garlic press, hanging prisoners by their arms for extended periods until they confessed, burning their fingers with lit matches. Maria Grimm, a prisoner in Berlin, observed in October 1942 how Mildred Harnack was brought in on a stretcher after one of her extended interrogations. Mildred Fish, born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1902, was a member of the resistance network known as the Red Orchestra. She was brought in on a stretcher, barely breathing. Two Gestapo officers lifted her, saying, "Are you feeling better, Mrs. Harnack?" and took her away to continue the interrogation. She was brought back on a stretcher. She tried to reach for a blanket, but collapsed. The Ministry of Justice frequently sent circulars to Gestapo agents warning that severe criminal penalties would be imposed if prisoners were mistreated during custody. These circulars coexisted with instructions for extended interrogations and with the widespread understanding that without confessions there was no case. The result was a systematic practice of torture that never appeared in documents but left its traces on bodies. The final decision regarding the fate of a detainee was more complex than popular myth suggests. Most cases did not end in a concentration camp. Many were closed without charges. Some resulted in warnings. others in fines or short prison sentences. Only cases that the Gestapo considered serious: active communists, systematic religious opponents, individuals with a history of resistance, escalated into the camp system. Sending someone to a camp was a last resort, at least during the first half of the Nazi period. This relative restraint had a function: to maintain the appearance of legality and make the organization seem reliable to ordinary German citizens who cooperated with it. If the Gestapo had sent everyone denounced to a concentration camp, people would soon have stopped denouncing others for fear of unpredictable consequences. The system of denunciation, when citizens became the weapon. This is the true core of the Gestapo's functioning, the mechanism that kept it operational with such limited resources: citizen-to-citizen denunciation. It is estimated that 26% of Gestapo cases began with a spontaneous report from a member of civil society. Only 15% originated from direct surveillance operations by the organization. The remainder came from other institutional sources: reports from the regular police, denunciations by party officials, communications from employers or prison administrators. The denunciators came from a remarkable range of social backgrounds, but lower middle class and working class members were the most represented. Middle class professionals accounted for less than 10% of those who reported others. Approximately 80% were men who contacted the Gestapo after witnessing incidents in their workplaces or leisure environments. Women represented 20% of all denunciations, and they typically accused husbands, relatives, and neighbors in domestic situations. A study of 213 denunciations drawn from Düsseldorf archives showed that 37% involved individuals reporting another person in order to resolve a personal conflict. The Gestapo was used as a tool of revenge in neighborhood disputes, workplace conflicts, marital quarrels, and commercial rivalries. The legal basis for denunciation was the Decree for the Protection of the National Movement from Malicious Attacks on the Government of March 1933, which criminalized making a factual statement that is untrue or exaggerated if it could cause serious harm to the welfare of the Reich. In practice, this turned any criticism of the regime, any political joke, any defeatist comment into a potential criminal accusation. In September 1939, a new law prohibited listening to foreign radio stations. The offense was punishable by imprisonment and, in the most serious cases, by death. German-language BBC broadcasts reached the entire population. In the first half of 1940, 2,197 people were arrested for this offense. 70% of these cases began with a denunciation by a neighbor, family member, or co-worker. The cases preserved in the Düsseldorf and Würzburg archives reveal the intimate mechanics of this system. Friedrich Weltbach, a worker in a copper factory in Duisburg, denounced his foreman Heinrich Witt in September 1933 because he refused to perform the Nazi salute and made disparaging comments about the regime. As a result, Witt was sent to a local concentration camp. Witt's brother hired a lawyer and mobilized testimonies from respectable citizens who described Heinrich as an old-school patriot. The Gestapo released him without charges after he signed a declaration promising not to act against the wishes of the state. Frau Hoff told the Gestapo in May 1939 that her husband made negative comments about the regime and was politically left-wing. The investigation revealed that she actually wanted to get rid of him in order to continue an affair with a young soldier. The Gestapo recognized the personal motive, filed the case away, fined the husband 10 Reichsmarks for possession of an unauthorized weapon, and closed the file. In Krefeld, on December 15, 1941, Celine Winters was denounced by a relative who had seen her with a copy of Bishop Clemens von Galen's sermon against Nazi euthanasia. Celine was 68 years old and turned out to be a fervent supporter of the Nazi regime who approved of euthanasia. The Gestapo released her without charges once her position became clear. And in November 1941, Peter Holdenberg, a disabled bookseller of 63 who lived alone on the third floor of a building in Essen, was denounced by 3 neighbors who claimed they had heard him through the shared wall, tuning into BBC and Radio Moscow broadcasts. Holdenberg denied everything. 3 additional witnesses gave contradictory statements. The day after his arrest, Holdenberg attempted to hang himself in his cell. He was found alive and rushed to a hospital. He died the next day. The denunciation system had an additional element that amplified its reach: the block wardens, blockleiter, responsible for monitoring between 40 and 60 households each. They updated files on all residents, party affiliation, marital status, employment data. They noted which families displayed Nazi flags on their facades and which did not, whether they attended parades and rallies. Ingeborg Tismer, a Berlin resident, would recall decades later, "We never knew when the block warden would show up to stick his nose in. We only knew that sooner or later he would come." On October 28, 1942, block warden Max Reich, aged 37, saw a graffiti inscription in a public restroom in Berlin. "Hitler mass murderer, he must be killed to end the war." Returning days later, he caught the elderly Wilhelm Lehm, aged 73, writing with chalk in a stall. He denounced him. On March 8, 1943, Lehm was sentenced to death by the People's Court. He was executed on May 10th of that year. The system did not need the Gestapo to see everything. It only needed every citizen to fear that the neighbor next door might be watching. The first enemies: the hunt for communists. Communists were the first systematic target of the Gestapo and the group that suffered the most brutal persecution during the early years of the Nazi regime. In January 1933, the German Communist Party, the KPD, was the largest communist party outside the Soviet Union. It had 360,000 official members with an average age of 30. Ernst Thälmann, its charismatic leader, was a man of the people who resonated in the working-class districts of Berlin, Stuttgart, Hamburg, Cologne, Düsseldorf, and Mönchengladbach. In the November 1932 elections, the KPD obtained 37.7% of the vote in key industrial areas. On the night of the Reichstag fire, February 27, 1933, 10,000 communists were arrested. In 1933 alone, an estimated 60,000 communists ended up in camps or prisons, and approximately 2,000 were killed. On July 14, 1933, the KPD was officially banned. However, it did not dissolve. The party leadership instructed its members to continue underground resistance. The key weapon was the written word: newspapers, publications, pamphlets. In 1934, the Gestapo confiscated 1,238,202 communist pamphlets. In 1935, another 1,670,300. The underground newspaper Rote Fahne, Red Flag, continued to be published illegally between 1933 and 1945. On October 13, 1933, the distribution of treasonous literature became a crime punishable by death, life imprisonment, or 15 years in prison. Ernst Thälmann, arrested on March 3, 1933, was placed in solitary confinement, subjected to repeated interrogations, and beaten multiple times in various prisons and concentration camps. On August 18, 1944, 11 years after his arrest, he was shot on Hitler's personal order at the Buchenwald concentration camp. Communist resistance slowly bled out. By October 1935, of the 422 key KPD officials who existed when Hitler came to power, 219 were in custody, 125 had fled into exile, 24 had been murdered, and 42 had left the party. Only 12 remained at large. It is estimated that by that year, only 10% of the original 360,000 KPD members were still actively involved in underground activities. Jakob Zorn, one of the party leaders who was arrested in 1934 and released in 1937, described the decline of resistance with precision. "I saw how much it had dwindled. The number of victims was enormous. The losses the party had suffered, that anti-fascism in general had suffered, had reduced the resistance to almost nothing." The Gestapo uncovered communist networks through a mixture of active surveillance, infiltration by informants, and the already mentioned cooperation of citizens. Rudolf Gogol, head of a communist union of office workers, described the results of attempting to recruit discontented members of the SA after the Night of the Long Knives. KPD activists were denounced one by the same SA men with whom they had naively formed friendships. The official arrest statistics tell the story: 11,678 communists arrested in 1936. In 1937, the number fell to 8,068. In 1938, 3,800. Organized resistance was being systematically destroyed. The case of Eva Buch, born in Berlin in 1921, summarized what it meant to be a communist in that system. A student of foreign languages at Humboldt University, Eva was part of the socialist resistance group Schulze Boysen Harnack, which the Gestapo called the Red Orchestra. On October 10, 1942, she was arrested after it was discovered that she had written and translated a pamphlet calling on forced French laborers to resist the Nazi regime. When the officer interrogating her offered her a deal if she would betray her comrades, she replied, "That would make me as petty and depraved a person as you want me to appear." She was sentenced to death. On the day of her execution, she wrote to her parents, "I am sorry that I could not spare you this terrible grief, but it is right that it ends like this. Now everything is calm and peaceful." The racial war, the asocials and eugenic terror. From the mid-1930s onward, the Gestapo expanded its definition of enemy beyond political and religious opponents to what the Nazis called social marginals, a category broad enough to include almost anyone who did not fit into the idealized image of the national community. In 1937, Reinhard Heydrich defined the role of the security police in explicitly racial terms. The police were to safeguard the German people as a total being, its vital force and institutions of all kinds from destruction and disintegration. Eugenics, that pseudoscience which sought to improve the human race through selective reproduction, became state policy. On July 14, 1933, the Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring was published. It came into force on January 1, 1934. It authorized compulsory sterilization for people with congenital mental weakness, schizophrenia, manic depressive psychosis, epilepsy, Huntington's disease, hereditary blindness, deafness, or severe physical disability. It also included chronic alcoholics. Estimates of the total number of people sterilized in Nazi Germany range between 350,000 and 400,000. Around 5,000 women died from post-operative complications of the complex tubal ligation procedure. On November 24, 1933, the law against habitual dangerous criminals allowed indefinite preventive detention for anyone who had been convicted twice for any crime. Between 1934 and 1939, 1,808 prisoners were forcibly castrated. Approximately 70% were convicted pedophiles. Nazi criminologists presented these policies as successes. They claimed that the recidivism rate for sexual crimes was less than 5%. In March 1937, the Kripo organized large-scale raids against habitual criminals. Result: 2,752 arrests, including 938 burglars, 741 pickpockets, 495 sexual offenders, and 426 swindlers. Only 372 were released. 68 died in prison. The most macabre experiment of applied eugenic thought were the Haschud families in Bremen. In 1936, the authorities created a closed and guarded neighborhood for families considered asocial, 84 concrete and iron houses resistant to vandalism, with all main doors visible from a watchtower staffed by armed guards. A double hedge concealed a barbed wire fence around the perimeter. The cost was 600,000 German marks. The selected families had histories of alcoholism, vandalism, and minor crimes. The men were forced into hard labor, the women into long hours of domestic cleaning, and the children attended an internal daycare under strict supervision. In July 1940, the facility was closed. Only 59 of the 84 families had improved sufficiently to return to the community. 18 were classified as not reformed at all. The experiment was too expensive and was not repeated anywhere else. German teenagers did not escape the system either. The Edelweiss Pirates, groups of young people between 14 and 19 years old from the working-class districts of Cologne, Düsseldorf, Essen, Wuppertal, and Duisburg, represented a form of cultural resistance that deeply irritated the regime. They wore shorts, white sweaters, long hair, and carried knives in their socks. They attacked members of the Hitler Youth in urban subways. They painted anti-Nazi graffiti on public buildings. In December 1942, the Gestapo organized raids across the entire Rhineland region. 283 youths arrested in Düsseldorf, 260 in Duisburg, and 196 more in Essen and Wuppertal. On November 10, 1944, the Cologne Gestapo arrested and publicly hanged 13 members of the Edelweiss pirates in the Ehrenfeld district, a calculated display of power designed to deter anyone else. The Sinti and Roma gypsies suffered a particularly systematic persecution. In 1933, there were about 28,000 in the Third Reich. Dr. Robert Ritter, a physician born in Aachen in 1901 with a doctorate in psychology, built an academic apparatus of persecution. He interviewed thousands of gypsies between 1936 and 1940, compiled detailed files, which would later prove to have incalculable value for deporters, and concluded that mixed-race gypsies living in urban areas had contaminated their Aryan blood. Himmler's decree of December 8, 1938, ordered the fight against the gypsy plague in terms of the internal characteristics of that race. On December 16, 1942, Himmler ordered the mass deportation of gypsies to the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp. The deportation began on March 1, 1943. Of the 28,627 gypsies who originally lived in Germany and Austria, it is estimated that about 15,000 survived. The persecution of the Jews, from boycott to deportation. At 11 o'clock in the morning on March 11, 1933, Ludwig Furder, a Jewish lawyer, was in his office in the main courthouse building in Breslau when the door was kicked open. Two burly SA men burst in shouting, "Jews out!" An SA officer struck Furder on the head near the scars of his wounds from the First World War. He asked the judge who was present, "Is he Jewish?" The elderly judge replied, "Yes, he is a Jewish lawyer." The officer turned to his men, "Get the Jew out of here." Furder later described what happened. When asked by the judge what authority he should address a complaint to, Furder replied, "I fear there is no such authority left anymore." He was right. In 1933, 525,000 Jews lived in Germany. They had never represented more than 1.09% of the population between 1871 and 1931. They were deeply integrated. 15% of Jews were married to non-Jews in 1905. By 1933, that figure had risen to 44%. During the First World War, 100,000 Jews enlisted, 70,000 served at the front, 30,000 received decorations, 12,000 died. Klaus Moser, son of a Jewish banker born in 1922, would later recall it as follows: "If someone had asked my father or my mother in 1930 or 1931, 'And what are you?' they would have said, 'German.' My father fought in the First World War. He received the Iron Cross. My parents would never have denied their Judaism, but first and foremost they were Germans." The persecution was a gradual and cumulative process. On April 1, 1933, a national boycott of Jewish shops took place. On storefronts, SA men stood holding signs, "Whoever buys from Jews betrays the people." Laws excluded Jews from the civil service, the legal profession, secondary schools, and universities. The violently anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer appeared on advertising pillars in every city, with physically repulsive caricatures on its front pages. Contrary to popular belief, during the first 2 years of Hitler's rule, the persecution of law-abiding Jews was not a direct priority for the Gestapo. In Krefeld, only 8 Jews were arrested by the Gestapo during the whole of 1933, and 7 of them were active communists. That changed with the Nuremberg Laws of September 15, 1935. Passed in a special session convened in Nuremberg, these laws redefined German citizenship and criminalized relations between Jews and non-Jews. From that moment on, the Gestapo became directly involved in the persecution of the Jews. The laws established a taxonomy of blood. A full Jew was someone with 3 or more Jewish grandparents. Mischlinge, mixed race, of first degree had 2 Jewish grandparents and of second degree 1. Children of mixed marriages with Jewish ancestry lost full citizenship but retained a certain protection which, paradoxically, would later save many of them from deportation. The crime of Rassenschande, racial defilement, criminalized sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews. The Gestapo created specialized units to detect it. In Berlin, the Gestapo recruited teenagers and prostitutes to seduce Jews and catch them in compromising sexual situations. Between 1935 and 1940, 1,900 people were convicted of this offense. The historian Robert Gelatelli, studying the Würzburg archives, showed that 57% of those cases began with a denunciation by an ordinary German citizen. Without the collaboration of the population, it would have been practically impossible to enforce these policies. Kristallnacht, the night of 9th to 10th November 1938, represented a turning point. It all began on 7th November when Herschel Greenspan, a 17-year-old German Jewish refugee living in Paris, discovered that his parents had been deported from Hanover to Poland. He went to the German embassy with a pistol. The first person he encountered was Ernst vom Rath, a low-ranking official. He shot him 5 times. 2 days later, vom Rath died of his wounds. Goebbels wrote in his diary, "The actions will not be interrupted. Arrests of 20,000 to 30,000 Jews are being prepared." Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo, sent a circular to local offices at 5 minutes to midnight on November 9th, instructing agents not to prevent synagogues from being set on fire or Jewish shops from being vandalized. Although they were to stop indiscriminate looting, Heydrich at 1:20 a.m. sent more detailed orders. Jews, especially wealthy ones, were to be arrested. The destination, concentration camps. That night, approximately 91 Jews were murdered, 30,000 were arrested, around 10,000 shops were destroyed, and hundreds of synagogues were burned. The calculations of material damage, broken glass, destroyed goods, burned property, were sent to the Jews in the form of a penalty of atonement, 1 billion German marks that German Jews themselves had to pay. Some ordinary Germans were shocked. A report from underground social democratic activists noted that the brutal measures taken against the Jews have caused great indignation among the population, and that in working-class districts questions circulated such as, where will Germany end up if these methods are used? But most Germans simply continued with their lives. The systematic deportations began on October 1, 1941. By then, there were only 163,696 Jews registered in Germany. The others had emigrated, had been murdered, or had found other ways to disappear. The first trains took Jews to ghettos in Łódź, Riga, and Minsk, and later to the extermination camps of Belzec and Auschwitz-Birkenau. The deportation process revealed the bureaucracy of horror in its full scale. The RSHA in Berlin sent instructions to the local Gestapo. Officers contacted the leaders of Jewish communities and asked them to prepare lists. Jews designated for deportation received a letter, sometimes only 2 days in advance, with their identification number and reporting date. At the offices of the Jewish community, they signed declarations in which they acknowledged being enemies of the state and transferred all their property to the Reich. Their personal belongings were auctioned off. They were allowed to take only 1 suitcase. Valerie Wolfenstein, daughter of a Jewish Berlin architect, described the process. The person received a letter notifying them of the day they had to be ready. They had to make a list of all their property and take it to the office of the Jewish community, to which the Gestapo delegated all the preparatory work. Some Jews went into hiding. It is estimated that there were about 5,000 Jews in hiding in Germany during the war, and in 1945, 1,402 hidden Jews were found in Berlin alone. Rolf Joseph, a worker at the IG Farben factory in Berlin, decided to go into hiding in the summer of 1942 to escape deportation. "During the first 4 months, we had no shelter," he recalled. "Hundreds of illegals, as we called ourselves, lived like this. We rode trams or the subway late into the night, always afraid of being stopped. We spent nights in parks and forests, and when the weather was very bad, in the toilets of the railway station." When Rolf was finally arrested, the Gestapo insisted on knowing where he lived. He said he had no roof over his head. No one believed him. "They took me to a basement, tied my hands and feet, strapped me to a wooden box, and gave me 25 lashes with a whip on my bare buttocks. I had to count each blow." The most extraordinary case of collective resistance to deportations occurred on February 27, 1943. The Nazi authorities announced that all remaining Jews would be deported. Around 200 Aryan German wives of Jewish men spontaneously gathered outside the offices of the Jewish community in Rosenstrasse, Berlin. They kept shouting, "Give us back our husbands." For a week, the protest grew. Up to 1,000 women gathered. On March 6, 1943, Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi Gauleiter of Berlin, decided to release the 1,700 Jews in mixed marriages being held in the building. They were concerned about the impact on public opinion. The courage of those women saved their husbands. Of the 525,000 Jews living in Germany in 1933, between 134,000 and 160,000 were deported and murdered in the Holocaust. Most of the survivors were part of mixed marriages or their children. The Gestapo in Vienna, the Austrian case. On March 12, 1938, German troops crossed the Austrian border. The following day, March 13th, Adolf Hitler entered Vienna amid mass cheering crowds. The Anschluss, the annexation of Austria to the Reich, was celebrated by hundreds of thousands of Viennese in the streets. For Vienna's Jews, it meant immediate terror. On the night of March 11th, while the invasion had not yet been fully completed, gangs of anti-Semitic Viennese were already forcing Jews to clean the streets on their knees using their own fur coats as cleaning rags, while groups of spectators applauded. It was an outburst of street anti-Semitism that surprised even some German Nazis due to its intensity and spontaneity. The Gestapo in Vienna was installed in the Hotel Metropole on Morzinplatz, an elegant neo-Gothic building constructed in 1873 that had previously been one of the city's luxury hotels. With a staff that would exceed 900 people, the Gestapo Leitstelle Wien, the regional headquarters of Vienna, became the largest Gestapo office in the Reich after Berlin, even larger than Prague. Its area of responsibility covered more than 3.5 million people. The provinces of Vienna, Lower Austria, and northern Burgenland, plus parts incorporated from Czechoslovakia. The Vienna Gestapo carried out around 50,000 arrests between 1938 and 1945. Its detainees were routinely subjected to brutal interrogations and torture before being sent to concentration camps or handed over to the courts. Franz Josef Huber, born in 1902 in Mitterfels, Bavaria, became head of the Vienna Gestapo in 1938. He studied law in Munich and earned a doctorate. He had joined the SS and the Nazi Party during the Weimar Republic. Karl Ebner, his deputy from 1942, was Viennese, born in 1894, and also a lawyer. These two men would lead the Vienna Gestapo throughout the entire war. What distinguished the Vienna Gestapo from its counterparts in other cities was the scale of the Jewish question it inherited. Before the Anschluss, Vienna had the largest German-speaking Jewish community in Europe, 176,034 people, 9.4% of the city's total population. Adolf Eichmann was sent to Vienna in August 1938 to establish the Central Office for Jewish Emigration, which within months organized the forced expulsion of 50,000 Austrian Jews, a deportation pace that would serve as a model for what came later across Europe. Violence against Viennese Jews began immediately, and with a ferocity that even impressed members of the Nazi apparatus itself. Between March 13th and March 15th, 1938, in the days immediately following the Anschluss, acts of violence took place in Vienna that the SS in Berlin internally described as excesses that were difficult to justify. The first major transport of Austrians to Dachau left on April 1st, 1938. Its passengers were mainly former officials of the Austro-Hungarian government, social democratic and Christian social politicians, aristocrats linked to the former regime, and prominent Jews. Among them was former Federal Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg, who would spend the following years in solitary confinement. The Hotel Metropole, headquarters of the Gestapo, was itself a place of daily terror. Its basement housed interrogation cells where detainees were systematically tortured. The verschärfte Vernehmung, enhanced interrogations, the official euphemism for torture, included prolonged beatings, the so-called swing, in which the victim was suspended by their hands tied behind their back, and waterboarding. Post-war records from the trials of the Vienna People's Court document dozens of testimonies about these practices. The Vienna Gestapo also deployed an extensive system of informants. Hans Schafranek, a historian who studied these files in detail, documented how the infiltration of undercover agents destroyed virtually all organized resistance networks in Vienna. Methods included coercing prisoners into becoming informants to avoid being sent to concentration camps and inserting agents who posed as resistance members in order to gain the trust of groups. The Vienna Gestapo also played a direct and crucial role in the deportation of Jews. Contrary to what has been emphasized in some publications, it was not only Eichmann's central office that was responsible. The role of Huber and Ebner in planning and executing the deportations was decisive. In an initiative that researchers call reinsurance, Huber and Ebner deliberately cultivated the gratitude of some prominent detainees from the Catholic conservative camp by giving them relatively better treatment. When the post-war period arrived, those benefited survivors testified in favor of their former jailers in court trials. This strategy worked. Both Huber and Ebner avoided severe convictions. The Hotel Metropole was destroyed by Allied bombs in 1945. Today, a monument to the victims of the Vienna Gestapo stands in its place. The end of the Reich, the last days of the Gestapo. On the afternoon of April 23, 1945, Berlin, which had been the capital of the Third Reich, was burning under Soviet fire. Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo, descended into the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery for one of the last investigations of his career. Hitler was convinced that someone was leaking information to the Allies. Müller identified the main suspect, SS General Hermann Fegelein, husband of Eva Braun's sister and a close associate of Himmler. Fegelein had missed 6 of the last military meetings in the bunker. He was located, arrested, interrogated, and confessed. On April 28th, he was executed in the garden of the Chancellery. It was the Gestapo's last formal investigation. Müller was seen alive for the last time on May 2, 1945. Then he disappeared. In 1963, West German authorities exhumed a coffin bearing his name in a Berlin cemetery. The forensic examination revealed that the coffin contained the remains of 3 individuals. None of them was Müller. What happened to him afterward remains an unsolved mystery. Simon Wiesenthal was convinced that he lived under a false identity for decades, possibly in the Soviet Union or in South America. He was never found, never tried. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the terror system, attempted to negotiate with the Allies behind Hitler's back. When the Führer learned of this, he reacted with explosive fury at the betrayal of one of his closest collaborators. Himmler fled with false identity papers under the name Heinrich Hitzinger. He shaved off his moustache, put on civilian clothes, removed his glasses, and wore a patch over his left eye. At a checkpoint on the road near Bremerwörde, he was captured by British troops. While a doctor examined him, he bit a cyanide capsule. He died 5 minutes later. The man who had created the Nazi terror system succeeded in evading justice. Adolf Eichmann, who was in Austria when the war ended, was briefly held in an American internment camp but managed to escape. In 1952, he was in Argentina under the name Ricardo Clement, working in a Mercedes-Benz factory in Buenos Aires. His wife and children traveled from West Germany to join him without raising suspicion. He lived like this until May 11, 1960, when a team of 8 agents from the Israeli intelligence service captured him and transported him to Israel to stand trial. The trial of Eichmann in Jerusalem began on April 11, 1961, and lasted for months. He was the highest-ranking administrative official of the Gestapo to face proceedings since Nuremberg. 112 witnesses testified, among them numerous Holocaust survivors. The writer Hannah Arendt, who covered the trial, summarized Eichmann's disturbing normality in a formula that has become immortal: the banality of evil. Eichmann was not a monster. He was a bureaucrat who brought his sandwich to work, enjoyed playing with his children in the afternoons, and looked forward to summer holidays with his family. He admitted to organizing the deportation of the Jews, but felt no personal responsibility for the consequences. "My superiors were the real criminals," he repeated. On December 12, 1961, he was found guilty. On May 31, 1962, he was hanged at midnight. The Nuremberg Trials and the Scandal of Impunity. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg began its sessions on November 14, 1945. There were 403 public hearings presided over by the British judge Sir Geoffrey Lawrence. Among the trials included was the prosecution of the Gestapo as a criminal organization alongside the SS and the SD. Hermann Göring, the creator of the Prussian Gestapo, became one of the 22 main defendants. Rudolf Merkel, the defense lawyer for the Gestapo, mounted a sophisticated argument. He claimed that the organization was fundamentally a state institution operating under German law. Its agents were career police officers who obeyed orders. The concept of collective guilt was incompatible with German legal principles. He also challenged prevailing assumptions. With only 15,000 to 16,000 agents, the Gestapo could never have monitored all Germans. Most of its personnel were professional police officers from the Weimar era, not Nazi fanatics. On September 30th, 1946, the verdict declared the Gestapo a criminal organization. Its agents had arrested and interrogated people who ended up in concentration camps. They had systematically persecuted communists, religious groups, and Jews. They had mistreated and murdered prisoners of war and foreign workers. Many had taken part directly in mass killings in the Soviet Union, but the ruling contained a loophole that defense lawyers would exploit for decades. It declared the Gestapo criminal only from the beginning of the Second World War. This eliminated the possibility of prosecuting agents for crimes committed before 1939. 12 of the 22 defendants were sentenced to death. Göring committed suicide with cyanide on October 16, 1946, the day he was to be executed. Wilhelm Frick, the interior minister who for years had unsuccessfully tried to place limits on Himmler, went to the gallows. What happened afterward was a historical scandal of colossal proportions. The denazification courts, the so-called Spruchkammern, operated in a chaotic and extraordinarily lenient manner. The 5 categories of culpability ranged from major offenders to exonerated. Based on the Nuremberg verdict, all Gestapo agents should have been classified as major offenders. This never happened. In the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, with 4 million inhabitants, only 90 former Nazis were placed in the top 2 categories. The process became a dark joke. The Persil certificate, Persilschein, named after the popular detergent that promised to wash clothes whiter than white. Applicants collected testimonies from people they had treated well during interrogations, and their 12-year police files simply disappeared. Most Gestapo agents ended up classified as exonerated and regained their generous state pensions. Otto Diels, a Gestapo officer from Krefeld who had served between 1934 and 1945, gathered impressive references from colleagues and secretaries who described him as a charming and very professional man. But 15 victims came forward to tell a different story. Irmgard Mendling, a Jehovah's Witness, described the brutal beating Diels inflicted on her. Karl Lummers, a communist typesetter, claimed to have received repeated blows and kicks. Josef Ritting, arrested in 1935 for distributing communist leaflets, described how Diels hit him in the face, attacked him with a chair leg, and delivered brutal kicks while he was tied up until he lost consciousness. He appeared in court in a wheelchair. On 27 May 1949, Diels was sentenced to 2 years and 7 months in prison, with credit for time already served in internment camps. On June 13, 1950, he was released. He was classified as exonerated and received his full pension. Karl Löffler, former head of the Jewish section in the Cologne Gestapo, responsible for organizing the deportations of Jews to death camps, managed to have his denazification category reduced from minor offender to exonerated, thanks to testimonies from people he had interrogated, including priests, socialists, and Jews. He complained that during the period of his highest criminal activity, when he organized deportations, he had received the highest salary, and that his pension should be calculated on that basis. In 1956, the government of North Rhine-Westphalia granted him a full pension. It is estimated that around 50% of former Gestapo agents were reassigned to civil service positions in the Federal Republic of Germany. Most senior officers with law degrees resumed their careers as private lawyers. By 1950, 120,000 Nazi state officials, including many Gestapo agents, had been rehabilitated under Article 131 of the Basic Law of the Federal Republic. The most serious trials had to wait decades. The Auschwitz trial in Frankfurt, which began on December 20th, 1963 and ended on August 19th, 1965, was the largest war crimes trial held in West Germany. 359 witnesses testified, including 248 Auschwitz survivors. It lasted 183 days. The prosecutor Fritz Bauer, himself Jewish, persecuted by the Gestapo in 1933, exiled to Denmark, and returned to Germany after the war, was the driving force behind the proceedings. Bauer had discovered that Eichmann was living in Argentina, and when he realized that German authorities would not act, he passed the information to the Israeli Mossad. The case of Gestapo officer Wilhelm Boger, who had headed the political department at Auschwitz from 1942, illustrated the nature of terror in the camps. Witness Mrs. Braun for the prosecution described his torture techniques. Prisoners were stripped and handcuffed to an iron bar hanging from the ceiling. A guard would push them until they formed a slow arc while Boger asked questions, first calmly and then shouting. With each swing back, another guard armed with an iron bar struck the victim on the buttocks. As the swinging continued and the moans weakened, they were revived so that the screams could continue and the blows would not stop until in front of them there hung only a mass of bloody flesh. Most died during the ordeal. Boger was sentenced to life imprisonment. Werner Best, the brilliant jurist who had been the ideologue of the Gestapo and later Nazi governor of Denmark, was sentenced to death in Denmark in 1948. He was never executed. He was released in 1951 and returned to West Germany. In 1958, a court ordered him to pay a fine of 70,000 marks. By then, he was working as a well-paid legal advisor for the Stinners Company. In 1972, the German authorities suspended his case due to poor health. He was never tried. He died on June 23, 1989, without having paid for his crimes. Otto Bovensippen, head of the Gestapo in Berlin, who organized the deportation of 40,000 Berlin Jews between 1941 and 1943, obtained a well-paid job in a West German insurance company after the war, rising to become general director. His trial began in December 1969. He suffered a heart attack. He was declared unfit to stand trial. The proceedings were suspended in November 1971. He lived comfortably for another 8 years and died in 1979. The Gestapo did not pay either. The legacy. What exactly was the Gestapo? Historical research over the past decades has dismantled several myths simultaneously. The Gestapo was not the omnipresent, infallible organization that Nazi propaganda portrayed and that popular imagination repeated for decades. It was a small organization with limited resources which depended to a significant extent on citizen denunciation to function. Its agents, for the most part, were not ideological fanatics but career officials. Professional police officers trained before 1933 who adapted pragmatically to the demands of the new regime. But dismantling that myth carries a risk, relativizing individual and collective responsibility. Individual cases show that the Gestapo treated ordinary German citizens who were denounced for minor behavior with surprising leniency. That is true. And simultaneously, it is also true that the same organization tortured communists, sent Jehovah's Witnesses to concentration camps for refusing to renounce their faith, organized with meticulous bureaucracy the deportation of hundreds of thousands of Jews to their deaths, and executed people for listening to foreign radio broadcasts. The Gestapo was selectively brutal. Terror was applied with precision against groups defined as enemies, communists, Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses, active resistors, and with relative moderation toward ordinary citizens who committed minor violations of the regime's code of conduct. That selectivity was deliberate. It was the condition for the organization to maintain the cooperation of the good citizens it needed to monitor the bad ones. The historian Robert Gelately summarized the key finding of his research on the Würzburg archives. Without the active cooperation of the general population, it would have been almost impossible for the Gestapo to implement anti-Semitic racial policies. The question this raises is not only what the Gestapo did. The question is what kind of society produces a system in which citizens denounce their neighbors over personal disputes, where co-workers report colleagues for comments in the canteen, where husbands denounce their wives and wives denounce their husbands, where a 73-year-old man is hanged for writing with chalk in a toilet cubicle. The victims of the Gestapo were not abstractions. They were Pastor Paul Schneider, murdered in the infirmary of Buchenwald with 5 lethal injections of strophanthin in July 1939 for refusing to abandon his parish. They were Walter Husmann, who wrote to his father on the day of his execution in May 1943, "I am dying as I lived, as a fighter." They were Helene Krabs, sent pregnant to Auschwitz in December 1942 because she had sheltered for 3 days a Jewish cousin who had escaped from the Riga ghetto. They were the 1,493 priests who remained in the Dachau concentration camp on March 15, 1945, 261 Germans, 791 Poles, 122 French, 64 Austrians, 38 Dutch, 34 Belgians, 29 Italians. The perpetrators were not abstractions either. They were Heinrich Müller, who frequently lunched at the Adlon with Heydrich discussing espionage cases. They were Werner Best, who after the war worked as a legal advisor for a major German company. They were Karl Löffler, who collected his full pension for years for the merits he had accumulated organizing deportations. The question raised by the history of the Gestapo, and which has no easy answer, is the same one posed by Martin Niemöller's poem. When systems are built on the normality of terror, when denunciation becomes a civic virtue, when complicity is more comfortable than courage, responsibility does not belong only to those who signed the decrees or administered the prisons. It also belongs to all those who looked the other way, and to all those who, through their small everyday decisions, kept the system running. The Gestapo did not fall from the sky. It grew from below.